In a quiet suburb of Seattle, Washington, an event occurred that shocked not only the local residents but the entire nation. On March 15, 2022, in the upscale neighborhood of Mercer Island, the body of 52-year-old James Ellison, a successful businessman and father of two, was discovered. His wife, Sarah Ellison, found him when she returned home after her morning jog. This tragedy instantly turned an ordinary Tuesday into the beginning of a complex and tangled investigation that would unveil the dark secrets of a seemingly perfect family. As the events unfold, the investigators will face a web of lies, betrayal, and hidden motives, where each new piece of evidence will cast doubt on the previous conclusions. The main suspect in this case becomes the victim's eldest son, 24-year-old Michael Ellison. But is he truly responsible for his father's death? Or is someone else behind this crime? The answers to these questions will be up to the detectives to find, as they work to uncover the most shocking crime in the history of this quiet suburb. Sarah Ellison, a 49-year-old homemaker and mother of two, started her day like any other. At 6:30 a.m., she went out for her customary morning jog along the scenic streets of Mercer Island. The weather was cool but clear, perfect for exercise. Sarah ran her usual route, which took about an hour, and returned home at approximately 7:40 a.m. As she entered the house, Sarah immediately sensed that something was wrong. An unusual silence hung in the air. Normally, at this time, her husband, James, would already be getting ready for work, and the sounds of his morning routine would fill the house. But today it was quiet. "James?" Sarah called out as she climbed the stairs to the second floor. There was no response. Approaching the bedroom door, Sarah noticed a faint smell she couldn't immediately identify. She opened the door and froze in the doorway. On the bed, partially covered by a blanket, lay James. His eyes were open but lifeless. A dark stain had spread across the white pillow next to his head. Sarah screamed. Her cry echoed through the house, shattering the morning stillness. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "911? What's your emergency?" came the operator's voice. "My husband. I think he's dead," Sarah managed to say, barely holding herself together. The operator asked Sarah to provide the address and stay on the line. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity to Sarah, she heard the sirens of approaching police cars and ambulances. The first to arrive was Patrol Officer Michael Rodriguez. Entering the house, he found Sarah sitting on the floor in the hallway of the second floor. She was pale and shaking. Officer Rodriguez quickly assessed the situation and called for backup. The paramedics, who arrived shortly after, confirmed that James Ellison was dead. A preliminary assessment indicated that the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. The exact time of death would need to be determined by the medical examiner. Within the next hour, the Ellison home was transformed into a crime scene. Detectives from the Homicide Division arrived, and forensic experts began collecting evidence. Sarah Ellison was escorted to the living room on the first floor, where Detective Lisa Chun started a preliminary interview. "Mrs. Ellison, I'm very sorry for your loss," Detective Chun began. "I know this is a difficult time, but we need to ask you a few questions. When was the last time you saw your husband alive?" Sarah, still in a state of shock, struggled to focus on the question. "Last night," she replied. "We had dinner together around 8 in the evening. Then James said he had some work to finish and went to his office. I went to bed around 11. James was still working. Did you hear anything unusual during the night?" The detective continued. "No, I sleep soundly. I didn't hear anything," Sarah answered, her eyes filling with tears. Meanwhile, the forensic team discovered a handgun in James's bedside table. It was a Glock 19, registered in his name. A preliminary inspection showed that the gun had been fired recently. Detective Chun continued questioning Sarah, trying to piece together the events and learn about any possible enemies James might have had. However, the most critical question remained unanswered. Where were the Ellison children at the time of the tragedy? Detective Lisa Chun continued questioning Sarah Ellison, trying to reconstruct the timeline of events from the previous evening and night. Meanwhile, her partner, Detective John Morrison, coordinated the work of the forensic team at the crime scene. Mrs. Ellison, please tell me about your children, Detective Chen asked. Where are they now? Sarah took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. We have 2 children. Our older son, Michael, is 24. He lives in his own apartment in downtown Seattle. Our daughter, Emily, is 19. She's attending college in California. When was the last time you spoke with them? Chen asked. I talked to Emily on the phone yesterday afternoon. She was getting ready to go to a party with her friends. And Michael. Sarah paused for a moment. Michael stopped by last night. Detective Chen became alert. What time was that? Around 9 p.m. He often drops by without warning, Sarah replied. He and James were talking in the study. I heard them arguing, but I didn't intervene. It has been happening quite often lately. At that moment, Detective Morrison entered the room. Lisa, we need to talk, he said, nodding toward the door. Stepping into the hallway, Morrison lowered his voice. We have a problem. There are no fingerprints on the gun except James's. But we found a partial fingerprint on the bedroom door handle. And it doesn't belong to either James or Sarah. Chen frowned. Do you think it could be the son's fingerprint? Possibly. We need to find him and question him as soon as possible, Morrison replied. The detectives returned to Sarah. Mrs. Ellison, we need to contact your son. Do you have his phone number? Sarah provided Michael's number to the detectives. Chen immediately tried to call him, but the phone was turned off. Mrs. Ellison, do you have any idea where Michael might be right now? Chen asked. He should be at work. Michael works for an IT company downtown, Sarah replied. Morrison nodded and left the room to send officers to Michael's workplace. Meanwhile, the medical examiner, Dr. Alex Park, had finished his preliminary examination of the body. Detective Chen, may I speak with you? He called out. Chen walked over to Dr. Park, who was standing near the entrance to the bedroom. What do you have, doctor? Preliminary estimate of the time of death is between midnight and 2 a.m. Cause of death is a gunshot wound to the head at close range. But there's something else. Dr. Park lowered his voice. There are signs of strangulation on the victim's neck. It's possible the attacker first attempted to strangle James before shooting him. This information made Detective Chen pause. If the killer initially tried to strangle the victim, it could indicate a crime committed in a state of emotional distress rather than a premeditated murder. Just then, an officer who had just returned from Michael's workplace entered the house. Detective Michael Ellison isn't at work. His colleagues said he took the day off. Chen and Morrison exchanged looks. The situation was becoming increasingly tense. Where was Michael? And why did he take the day off today of all days? John, send a patrol to Michael's apartment. We need to find him, Chen ordered, and get in touch with the daughter. We need to confirm that she is actually in California. The detectives knew that time was against them. The longer Michael remained out of reach, the more suspicion fell on him. But was he truly responsible for his father's death? Or was there something more complex behind this crime? The answers to these questions were yet to be found. While the search for Michael Ellison continued, Detective Lisa Chen decided to delve deeper into the family's history. She understood that the key to solving the murder might lie in the Ellisons' past. The detective asked Sarah to tell her more about their family's life. Sarah began her story, her voice trembling with emotion. James and I met in college 27 years ago. He was studying business and I was studying psychology. It was love at first sight. We got married right after graduation. The first years of their marriage were filled with happiness and ambition. James started working at a small tech company and quickly climbed the career ladder. Sarah got a job as a school psychologist but decided to dedicate herself to her family after Michael was born. Michael was born 3 years after we got married. James was over the moon with joy. He always dreamed of having a son to whom he could pass on his business, Sarah continued. Detective Chen listened attentively, noting every detail. And how was the relationship between James and Michael during his childhood? Sarah paused for a moment. At first, everything was wonderful. James adored Michael and spent every free moment with him. But when Michael turned 10, something changed. It turned out that Michael began showing interest in art and literature, which did not align with his father's expectations. James wanted his son to be a future businessman, not a creative person. This became the cause of the first serious conflicts between father and son. James tried to redirect Michael's interests. He enrolled him in programming courses, took him to business seminars for teenagers. But the more he pushed, the more Michael resisted. Sarah sighed. The situation eased somewhat when Emily was born. James shifted some of his attention to his daughter, who, to his delight, showed an interest in science and business. But did James and Michael's relationship ever improve? Detective Chen asked. Sarah shook her head. They constantly argued, especially when it was time for Michael to choose a college. James insisted on a business school, but Michael wanted to study literature. They finally reached a compromise. Michael enrolled in an information technology program. But even that didn't stop the conflicts. Detective Chun asked the next question. And how have things been in the family recently? Tense, Sarah admitted. Michael was working at an IT company, but it wasn't the career he dreamed of. He often complained about feeling unhappy. James thought his son just wasn't trying hard enough. The last major conflict between father and son happened about a month ago. Michael announced that he wanted to quit his job and go to graduate school for literature. James was furious. He threatened to cut off Michael's financial support and even his inheritance. Was that what they were arguing about last night? Detective Chen asked. Sarah nodded. Yes, Michael came to talk to his father. I heard James yelling that Michael was a disappointment, wasting his life. Michael accused his father of never understanding or accepting him for who he is. Detective Chen pondered. The Ellison family history revealed a complex picture of relationships filled with resentment, misunderstanding, and disappointment. Could these long-standing conflicts have led to the tragedy? Or was there something else behind James's murder? Mrs. Ellison, did James have any enemies? Any business problems or personal conflicts? The detective asked. Sarah shook her head. James was a successful businessman, but I never heard of any serious problems or enemies. He was a demanding boss but fair. And in his personal life, well, we had our usual family issues, but nothing extraordinary. Detective Chun thanked Sarah for the information. The Ellison family story shed light on possible motives for the crime, but still left many questions unanswered. Where was Michael now? Why had he taken the day off work? And most importantly, was he truly capable of killing his own father? While Detective Chun continued interviewing Sarah Ellison, her partner, Detective Morrison, was busy examining James's office. The office, located on the first floor of the house, was furnished with expensive dark wood furniture. The walls were adorned with diplomas and awards, testifying to James's success in business. Morrison carefully examined the desk. It was covered with various documents, most of which were related to James's current business projects. However, one folder caught the detective's attention. It was labeled Michael Inheritance. Opening the folder, Morrison found a draft of a will dated last week. According to the document, James intended to significantly reduce the share of the inheritance allocated to Michael, redistributing most of the assets to Emily and several charitable organizations. Lisa, you might want to take a look at this, Morrison called to his partner. Detective Chun excused herself from Sarah and approached Morrison. After reading the document, she frowned. This could be a serious motive. But did Michael know about these plans? At that moment, an officer entered the room. Detectives, we found Michael Ellison. He's at his apartment and claims he overslept and didn't hear the calls. The officers have detained him and are bringing him in for questioning. Chin nodded. Good. Prepare the interrogation room. I want to speak with him as soon as he arrives. Returning to Sarah, Detective Chun decided to dig deeper into the details of the last conflict between James and Michael. Mrs. Ellison, you mentioned that Michael and James were arguing again last night. Can you tell me more about what the argument was about? Sarah sighed. Michael came over around 9 in the evening. He wanted to discuss his decision to leave IT and pursue literature with his father again. James was against it, as usual. I heard him yelling that Michael was ruining his life, that he was an ungrateful son. And what did Michael say? Chen asked. Michael, he was yelling too. He said his father never understood him, that he was tired of living someone else's life. He said he would be better off without a father like that. Sarah began to cry, recalling the conversation. Detective Chen gently placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. Mrs. Ellison, I know this is difficult, but we need to know all the details. What happened after the argument? Sarah wiped her tears. Michael left. He slammed the front door. James was furious. He locked himself in his office and didn't come out until late at night. I heard him talking on the phone, but I couldn't make out what it was about. Did you hear anyone come into the house after Michael left? Chen asked. No, I didn't hear anything. I took a sleeping pill and went to bed early. The last time I saw James was around 11 when he came up to the bedroom. At that moment, Morrison entered the room. Lisa, Michael Ellison is here. He's waiting in the interrogation room. Detective Chen nodded and turned to Sarah. Mrs. Ellison, thank you for your help. We'll continue the investigation and keep you informed. As they left the room, Chen and Morrison exchanged looks. What do you think? Morrison asked. It's too early to draw conclusions, Chen replied. But the picture that's emerging is troubling. Let's talk to Michael and see what he has to say. The detectives headed to the interrogation room, where the prime suspect in James Ellison's murder, his own son, was waiting for them. They understood that the upcoming conversation could be crucial in solving this complex case. Detectives Chen and Morrison entered the interrogation room, where Michael Ellison was waiting for them. The young man looked exhausted and tense. His eyes were red, as if from lack of sleep or tears. He was dressed casually, a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans, a sharp contrast to the usual business style his mother had mentioned. Mr. Ellison, I'm Detective Lisa Chen, and this is my partner, Detective John Morrison. We're investigating the death of your father, James Ellison. Chen began, carefully watching Michael's reaction. Michael flinched at the mention of his father's death. What? Dad is dead? How did it happen? His voice trembled. Detective Morrison cut in. Mr. Ellison, where were you last night between midnight and 2 a.m.? Michael looked confused. I was at home, in my apartment. I went to bed early because I took today off. I wanted to rest after yesterday's fight with my father. Can anyone confirm your alibi? Chen asked. Michael shook his head. No, I live alone. But you can check the cameras at the entrance to my building. I didn't go out all night. The detectives exchanged glances. The lack of an alibi did not work in Michael's favor. Tell us about your last conversation with your father, Chen continued. Michael took a deep breath. We argued again. I went over to tell him that I had decided to leave IT and go to graduate school for literature. He was furious. He yelled that I was ruining my life, that I was an ungrateful son. I lost my temper too. I told him I was tired of living under his thumb, that he never understood me. Did you threaten your father? Morrison asked sharply. What? No, of course not. Michael protested. Yes, we argued, but I would never harm him. He was still my father. Detective Chen decided to change tactics. Michael, we know about your father's plans to change his will. He intended to significantly reduce your share of the inheritance. Did you know about this? Michael turned pale. What? No, I didn't know. But it doesn't matter. I never cared about my father's money. I just wanted his understanding and support. Nevertheless, losing your inheritance could be a strong motive for murder, Morrison pointed out. I didn't kill my father, Michael exclaimed, slamming his fist on the table. Yes, we argued, but I loved him. I would never do something like that. Detective Chen closely observed Michael's reaction. His emotions seemed genuine, but her experience told her not to always trust first impressions. Michael, a partial fingerprint was found at the crime scene that doesn't belong to your father or your mother. Would you be willing to provide your fingerprints for comparison? Chen asked. Michael looked surprised but nodded. Yes, of course. I have nothing to hide. As Michael's fingerprints were being taken, The detectives stepped out of the interrogation room for a brief discussion. "What do you think?" Morrison asked. Chun shook her head thoughtfully. "It's hard to say. He has no alibi, a motive, and he had a conflict with his father. But his reaction to the news of the death and the change in the will seems sincere. We need more information." "Agreed." Morrison nodded. "I'll send people to check the cameras at Michael's building. We also need to interview the Ellisons' neighbors. Maybe someone saw or heard something." "Good," Chin agreed. "I'll continue talking with Michael for now. We need to find out if there are any details we've missed." The detectives knew that the case was becoming increasingly complicated. The evidence pointed to Michael, but his behavior raised doubts about his guilt. They realized they had a long and painstaking job ahead to uncover the truth and find James Ellison's real killer. Detective Chun returned to the interrogation room, where Michael Ellison was nervously tugging at the sleeve of his t-shirt. She decided to change her approach and try to establish a more trusting rapport with the suspect. "Michael, tell me more about your relationship with your father," Chun began. "When did the problems between you start?" Michael took a deep breath. "I guess it started when I was about 10. Before that, everything was fine. Dad was my hero. But then, he began to pressure me, making me do things I didn't like." "What exactly didn't you like?" the detective clarified. "Business, economics, programming. My father wanted me to follow in his footsteps. But I loved literature, art. I dreamed of becoming a writer," Michael said with a sad smile. "My father thought it was a waste of time." While Chun continued her conversation with Michael, Detective Morrison was busy verifying his alibi. He contacted the building manager where Michael lived and requested the surveillance footage. An hour later, Morrison returned with news. The footage confirms Michael's story. He returned home at 10:30 p.m. and didn't leave until the morning when our officers picked him up. This information made the detectives think. If Michael was telling the truth, then who killed James Ellison? "Michael," Chun addressed the suspect, "are you sure you didn't see or hear anything suspicious when you left your parents' house last night?" Michael shook his head. "No, nothing. I was upset and angry after the fight with my father. I just got in my car and left." "Did you notice any other cars near the house? Maybe someone passing by?" Chun persisted. Michael thought for a moment. "Actually, yes, there was a car. A dark sedan, maybe an Audi. I noticed it because it was parked with the lights off." This new information caught the detective's interest. "Can you describe the car in more detail? Or did you notice the license plate?" Morrison asked. "I didn't see the plates. It was dark. But the car was new, expensive. And I think there was a woman behind the wheel," Michael added. The detectives exchanged glances. This was the first lead that could take the investigation to a new level. "Thank you, Michael. This information could be very important," Chin said. "For now, we have to keep you in custody until we can clarify all the details. But we will continue the investigation and keep you informed." After Michael was taken to a holding cell, Chun and Morrison gathered in their office to discuss the case. "What do you think?" Morrison asked. "His alibi checks out, but he still has a motive." Chun shook her head thoughtfully. "Yes, but now we have a new lead. This woman in the Audi. Who is she? And why was she watching the Ellison house? We need to check traffic camera footage in the area," Morrison suggested. "Maybe we can trace this car." "I agree," Chin nodded. "We also need to talk to Sarah Ellison again. Maybe she knows something about this woman." The detectives knew the investigation was only beginning. The murder of James Ellison was proving to be far more complicated than it first seemed. Who was the mysterious woman in the Audi? What role could she have played in this story? And most importantly, who actually killed James Ellison? Cheon and Morrison knew they had a long road ahead to find the answers to all these questions and uncover the truth about what happened on that fateful night at the Ellison family home. Detectives Chun and Morrison returned to the Ellison home for a second conversation with Sarah. They hoped that new information about the mysterious woman in the Audi might shed light on the events of that night. "Mrs. Ellison," Detective Chun began, "we'd like to ask you a few more questions." Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Any unfamiliar cars near the house or suspicious people? Sarah tensed at the question. No, I can't recall anything like that. Why are you asking? Morrison decided to press further. Mrs. Ellison, your son mentioned seeing a dark Audi near the house on the night of the murder. There was a woman behind the wheel. Does that mean anything to you? Sarah's face paled. She hesitated for a moment before responding. I don't know anything about that. Detective Chen noticed the change in Sarah's demeanor. Mrs. Ellison, if you know something, now is the time to tell us. It could help us find your husband's killer. Sarah took a deep breath, as if preparing to confess. I'm not sure, but it could have been Carol Baker. Who is Carol Baker? Morrison asked. She works at James's company. His deputy, Sarah replied, avoiding the detective's eyes. Chun sensed there was more to the story. And why do you think it might have been her? Sarah hesitated for a few seconds before continuing. Because I suspected that James was having an affair with Carol. This news caught the detectives off guard. Why did you think that? Chen asked. James started staying late at work often. There were secretive calls and messages. Once I saw him hugging Carol at a corporate party. It looked too intimate for colleagues. Sarah spoke quietly, her voice trembling. Morrison made a note in his notebook. Why didn't you mention this earlier? I didn't want to believe it. And I didn't think it could be related to the murder, Sarah replied. The detectives exchanged glances. This revelation opened up an entirely new direction for the investigation. Mrs. Ellison, do you have Carol Baker's contact information? Chen asked. Sarah nodded and provided Carol's phone number and address. Leaving the Ellison home, the detectives headed straight for Carol Baker's residence. Her apartment was in an upscale area of Seattle. As they approached, they noticed a dark Audi parked at the entrance. Carol opened the door after several rings. She looked anxious as the detectives introduced themselves. Ms. Baker, we're investigating the murder of James Ellison. We need to ask you a few questions. Chen began. Carol turned pale. I don't understand. What does this have to do with me? You were seen near the Ellison house on the night of the murder. Can you explain that? Morrison asked. Carol hesitated for a moment but then replied decisively, I think I need a lawyer. These words only deepened the detectives' suspicions. They understood that Carol Baker could be the key to solving James Ellison's murder. But what really connected her to the deceased? And was she involved in his death? While Carol called her lawyer, the detectives waited in the living room, looking around the room. On a side table, Morrison noticed a photograph of Carol and James taken together at a corporate event. They appeared too close for mere colleagues. The investigation was taking an unexpected turn, and the detectives realized they were only beginning to unravel the complex web of relationships and secrets surrounding James Ellison. An hour later, Carol Baker's lawyer, Mark Stevens, arrived at her apartment. After a brief consultation with his client, he turned to the detectives. My client is willing to cooperate with the investigation, but please note that any statements she makes will be given voluntarily and without admitting any guilt. Detective Chen nodded. All right, Ms. Baker. Tell us, what were you doing near the Ellison house on the night of the murder? Carol took a deep breath. I was there. James called me late at night. He was upset after a fight with his son and asked me to come over. And you just sat in the car? Morrison asked skeptically. No, Carol replied. I went inside. James let me in through the back door. We talked in his office. What did you talk about? Chen inquired. James said he wanted to change everything. He was planning to divorce Sarah and we were going to be together. Carol lowered her eyes. The detectives exchanged glances. What happened next? Morrison asked. We went upstairs. James wanted to pack some things and leave with me. But then Sarah showed up. This news caught the detectives off guard. Sarah? But she said she was asleep. Chen noted. Carol shook her head. No, she wasn't asleep. She walked into the bedroom and found us. An awful argument started. James yelled that he didn't love her anymore, that he was leaving her for someone else. Sarah was hysterical. "And what happened next?" Morrison asked tensely. Sarah. She grabbed James's gun from the bedside table. She was screaming that if she couldn't have James, then no one would. I was terrified and ran out of the room. As I reached the stairs, I heard a gunshot. Carol began to sob. The detectives were stunned by this confession. "Why didn't you report this earlier?" Chen asked. "I panicked," Carol replied through her tears. "I got in my car and drove away. I was afraid they would accuse me of murder." The detectives quickly contacted the precinct and dispatched a patrol to pick up Sarah Ellison. Within an hour, she was already in the interrogation room. When Sarah was confronted with Carol's testimony, she initially denied everything. But under the weight of the evidence and inconsistencies in her own statements, she finally broke down. "Yes, I killed James," Sarah confessed, crying. "I couldn't bear the thought of him leaving me for that woman. After so many years of marriage, after everything we'd been through together, I just lost control." Detectives Chun and Morrison exchanged glances. The case was solved, but they felt no satisfaction. The tragedy of the Ellison family was deeper than they had initially imagined. Sarah Ellison was arrested on charges of first-degree murder. Michael was released from custody, and the detectives apologized for the suspicion cast on him. As they left the precinct, the detectives stood silently in the parking lot. "You know," Chun finally said, "sometimes I think the scariest part of our job isn't the criminals, but ordinary people who, in a moment of weakness, are capable of doing terrible things." Morrison nodded. "Yeah, and the saddest thing is that in these stories there are no winners, only victims." They got into their car and drove back to the precinct. Ahead of them was paperwork and preparation for the trial. As for the Ellison family, a long and painful recovery awaited them from a tragedy that had forever changed their lives. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories that are coming out every day.